At the end of my life, if I have a terminal illness and there is no reasonable hope for me to make a recovery, I do not wish to receive CPR in the event that my heart stops, and I do not wish to be kept alive on a breathing machine such as a ventilator. To my medical team, I please ask that you let me pass in peace, relatively pain-free, and please donate my organs to those in need. That is how I want to die. Now, how do you all want to die? I can understand that this question is a bit uncomfortable to answer, but I'm a medical student, and that gives me the privilege of being up front and center in the hospital to see what happens when this question is left unanswered. And to put it lightly, it's not nice. Before being asked to give this talk, I had never seriously considered asking anyone outside of my family or my patients what they thought about death or their end-of-life care. But that's what I decided to do. I asked my friends here in Vietnam what they thought on these topics and if they've ever broached the topic with their friends or relatives. And the answers that I got were not very surprising. I had one friend, a community organizer here in Hanoi, respond kind of in disbelief that I would even bring up the topic with my relatives. She was like, "Eric, what are you, nuts? Like, if I brought up death with my family, they'd think I want them to die or something." I had another friend who I describe as very zitting, very easygoing, kind of respond nonchalantly, "Eric ơi, con nước, con that," which has a very rough equivalent in English. Anyone who's ever seen a TV medical drama would know the phrase, "I want everything done that is possible. Spare no expense, do everything that you can to keep me alive as long as you can." I even have a doctor friend here in Hanoi who works at a local hospital. And so first thing in the morning, I walked straight up to him and asked, "Hey, how do you want to die?" To which he responded, "Eric, what the hell kind of question is that? Trời ơi, you don't know anything about Vietnamese culture at all, do you?" As it turns out, I made a double mistake. Not only did I ask about something very sensitive, but I asked at a very inopportune time. Because apparently, in Vietnamese culture, it's very bad luck to ask about negative things at the beginning of any time period. So maybe it's not the best idea to ask about death in the morning or at the beginning of a month or the beginning of a year. So I came back in the afternoon. I was like, "Okay, will you answer my question now?" To which he said, "No." And that was that. That was the end of the conversation. It's not surprising that in Vietnam, and also in other parts of the world, talking about death, especially before it occurs, is not the most popular thing to do. But I think it should be. I think that it's not only good for the patients, but also good for their families and their medical care team. When it comes to medicine, being prepared is just a good idea. Now, some of you may respond, just as my easygoing friend did, "Eric ơi, con nước, con that." We don't need to think about death or talk about it because we already know that everyone would clearly want everything done to keep them around as long as possible. But before we make that assumption, we really have to ask ourselves, what does do everything mean? And today I'd like to go through one procedure that is commonly done in the hospital as a part of do everything and end-of-life care. And that procedure is CPR. CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation, is the procedure that is done in the event that a patient's heart suddenly stops. It involves giving rescue breaths and chest compressions in an effort to keep the body perfused with oxygen and nutrients until you can revive the heart, which is usually with an electric shock. But there's a problem. We have a hard, sturdy cage of bone and cartilage protecting our hearts like a safe protects its valuables. And like you do when you have to get inside a safe as fast as possible, you do the same thing as you would with a heart. You have to crack the safe. And that is how proper CPR is done. You have to break a person's ribs in order to keep them alive. Not only that, but you have to pump on the chest at a rate of 100 to 120 times per minute to mimic that of a beating heart. And then, in order to get the heart starting again, you gotta give it an electric shock like you would a dead car battery. But this isn't some little electric shock that you get from like rubbing your feet on the carpet and pressing a doorknob. Now, a defibrillator can generate upwards of 3,000 volts of electricity, which is about as much as a standard police taser. So, CPR is not something to really be taken lightly. But many would rightly assumed that, all things considered, having a few broken ribs is worth having your life saved. But the next thing we have to talk about is how well does CPR actually work? Because we don't always talk about death or these death-delaying interventions, we're left to get our information from less reliable sources, such as Korean medical dramas and the sorts on television. But luckily, this has actually been studied in a systematic way. What these researchers did, sounds like a pretty sweet job, is just to watch TV. They watched 100 episodes of TV medical dramas and called it work in an effort to see how well CPR was portrayed on TV. And what they found was that CPR was grossly misrepresented on TV, particularly in how well it worked. They found that 75% of the patients who needed CPR ended up being revived, and then 66% of the patients ended up making it alive, being alive long enough to leave the hospital. But these results are misleading because these patients were often young, healthy before they needed CPR, and victims of acute injury such as a car accident. But in the context of chronic illness and terminally ill patients, as is the majority of patients who need CPR, the chances of success are much worse. And this has also been studied. And what this analysis did was look at a bunch of studies that have been done through the years on how well CPR worked. What they found was that, in reality, 50% of the people who needed CPR ended up having their heart restarted and revived. So 75% on TV, 50% in real life. They also had to look at, probably the more important question was, after you do CPR, how long do people survive? What percentage of patients end up leaving the hospital and continue on with their lives? That's called survival to discharge. So what they saw, so TV, 66%. And then when they looked at a whole bunch of chronic illnesses, at best, less than 25% of the people who received CPR made it out of the hospital alive. Now, when they looked just at cancer patients, the results, the outcomes of success are much worse. Only 15% of those patients will make it out alive. And then lastly, when you look at the patients in the ICU, the sickest patients, the sickest of the sick, the percentage of patients who end up leaving the hospital is just 2%. CPR is just one intervention in the list of do-everything cocktail of procedures. With interventions such as these, it becomes extremely important for patients and their families to know what's to be done, what the chances of success will be, and then what are the likely consequences that will result. But often, patients and their families learn of these things right before these interventions are needed, at a time when they are their most distraught and under the most stress. As a result, we often end up subjecting our patients and our families to needless pain and suffering. Pain and suffering that they might not have thought was worth it if they had made the decision under less stressful circumstances. Sometimes we are so focused on delaying death that we sacrifice and ignore the quality of life of that remaining time we have. Would you want your remaining time in this life to be spent with broken ribs, making it all but impossible to receive a warm hug from your family without searing pain? Would you want that remaining time to be spent with a breathing tube down your throat, making you unable to say "I love you" to the people who matter most? These are questions whose answers will change based on the patient and the situation at hand, but we'll never know unless we ask. And yet, a lack of knowledge surrounding what do everything means is not the biggest barrier to talking about death. Maybe some of you have inferred from what my friends have said, but the cultural context in which we live plays a huge role in determining our hesitancy about talking about death. My doctor friend was right. I don't know that much about Vietnamese culture, and I've only just begun to scratch the surface of what people think of death and end-of-life care in this country. But I keep learning, help mai, as they say, and because of that, through my learning, I have come to the conclusion that talking about death before it occurs is very compatible with Vietnamese culture. And I found a few phrases to illustrate this. Now the first one, chết ở nhà chứ không chết ở ngoài, which roughly translates to, dying at home is preferred to dying outside. This, of course, promotes dying in familiar surroundings in the presence of loved ones. And it promotes talking about death beforehand because in order to know what the patient wants, what your family and what you want, we have to ask, whether that is to be in the hospital or at home. The second one, chet na chứ không chet đói, or dying with a full stomach is better than dying hungry, can mean more than just the literal interpretation. From a different perspective, it can mean being satisfied with your end-of-life care, being satisfied with closure, and being satisfied with the knowledge and comfort of having a little bit of control in the most vulnerable of circumstances that all of us will one day face. And lastly, of course, con nước con tát, I want everything done as possible. I really didn't need to do much research on this one because this phrase is immediately identifiable in my culture as well. In fact, this is how hospitals used to run in the U.S. When these death-delaying interventions such as CPR were first brought into the hospital. It was thought that not using them would be unethical, and then once you started them, removing them would amount to murder. Con nước con tát was very widespread in the hospital landscape in the U.S. just decades ago. But that is changing because people are asking better questions. They're asking questions such as, is doing everything better than being pain-free and comfortable? Is it more important than tending to the soul? Is it more important than doing what the patient wants? And is that quality of time that you get, quality of that extra time that you get, worth the potential pain, suffering, and disability that could result in the process? Not all of my friends responded the way they did. I had one friend who really surprised me and left me hopeful when she said the following. I asked my parents if they had cancer, how would they want to be treated? If they didn't want further treatment, would they want to be in the hospital or at home? Vietnam does not allow for a humane death, but I really hope this will come to pass, because having the choice to die peacefully, the way I choose, would be much better than dying slowly and painfully. Culture is never so monolithic or never so static as we believe it to be. Vietnamese culture is compatible with talking about death, and in fact, talking about death is already a part of the culture, even if it's just on a small scale. When I asked my friend how her parents took the question, she said that they were very easygoing, casual, and really welcomed it. And that was because she thinks that it was because she brought it up sensitively, at an appropriate time, and in an appropriate setting. Simple as that. Sensitively and at an appropriate time in a comfortable setting. That can be difficult to achieve for those of us who are unfamiliar about talking about death. But luckily, death has been around for a really long time. And because of that, people have thought of ways and created resources for us who are less informed to tackle the subject. My favorite resource on the internet is Death Over Dinner. And what this website does is help you create a customized toolkit for creating your own death dinner. You can kind of think of it as an early anzo. For those of you who don't know, is a meal that you have with your friends and family to celebrate, or not celebrate, remember the death of a loved one. Now instead, this early anzo can be a time to contemplate death and plan for a peaceful transition to the afterlife. I have been very lucky in my life. In the time that I've been alive, no one in my immediate family has passed away. I still have 3 grandparents who I love and cherish dearly. But they're all in their mid-90s, and they have neither a sorcerer's stone nor a fountain of youth in their possession. But they are prepared. And like my grandfather in this picture, they've all written down exactly what they want to have happen at the end of their life if they can no longer make the decision for themselves. And not only that, but my parents, like my father here, who are hopefully very far from the end, have done the same. And when I broached my family about this topic about a year ago, I was nervous, as anyone would be. I didn't know really how they would take it or if they'd blow up at me, but I really shouldn't have been. My family is the most prepared group of people on the planet. My dad, for example, last year, he planned his birthday dinner from the restaurant all the way down to the sauce, how spicy he wanted the sauce on his tacos 5 months in advance. Evidently, their obsession for planning goes all the way up to the end of their lives. And because of that, the rest of our family won't need to argue or agonize or destroy each other to figure out what exactly needs to be done. Instead, we can focus on what's important, on supporting each other and celebrating the lives of those who matter most to us. Now, at the end of everything I said, maybe you're still a bit uncomfortable. You feel a bit uncomfortable about talking to death with your loved ones. Maybe you're still too be ngai, be so ho, and that is okay. I can understand that. But after hearing me today, are you ready to ask yourself how you want your end-of-life care to look? Are you ready to ask yourself, how do you want to die? If everyone here can do that today, I would call this talk successful. We can change the culture surrounding death, and by beginning to openly talk about it, we already have. Sin Kamaluna.